So it is my privilege to introduce our speaker, who is actually a knight in shining armor. I don't see where your armor is, but whatever.
I checked it out.
Oh, when I was looking to find out about David, I was just floored. First of all, he was at UVM for 49 years before retiring in 2023. I don't know any professor who's been at a university for 49 years. I think, is that a record?
No, there's a couple of guys who did 50 and I was in it. I was like, damn, I couldn't.
It blows my mind. You now head up the Barrington group. The Barrington group is a group of scholars and researchers who study the diversity and evolution of spore-dispersed plants, which are like ferns and club mosses, which I think is pretty cool. And of course, I'm a 7-year-old and I love all that. I would mention his scholarly works, but you would never understand most of them. And secondly, it runs for 10 pages or so. It's quite long, including all the works of the various scholars that he has. Oh, he's shaking his head. Helped along the way. He was the director of the Pringle Herbarium. How long did you do that? The whole time. Wow.
That's what I
So Wes has taken his shoes, and here's Wes' debut, and he gets COVID. So whatever. So Fanny's specimen collection of botanicals is in the Pringle Herbarium. And she, as my area of expertise is 18th century European, English, French, German, Italian literature and history. And I know how powerful women were at the end of the 18th century in England. And as a well-brought-up woman, knowing Latin, Fanny would have adopted either crewel, watercolor, botany, or some other incredible thing, which then turned herself into an expert, like many other late 18th century women did, who ran the salons, who started writing novels, who held the various beau mondes in London and Paris in thrall because they would visit their salons and would dictate taste. They're quite an amazing group of women throughout the continent and in England. In any case, he is going to give us a peek at the work and the various specimens in her amazing collection. So, David, thank you so much.
As I'm fond of saying, why you applaud it could be horrible. Indeed, I want to do exactly what you said, which is to introduce you to this pile of old specimens and give it some context. First of all, in Vermont botany, and second of all, in the history of Vermont, and in the history of botany. And so we'll kind of wander across this landscape. But I want to begin by talking about the actual collection itself and its history. So it's in fact two collections that we have at the Pringle Herbarium. One is the collection made by Fanny, and we'll use the name Penniman for now. And the other is by her youngest child of all the children she had, which was, by my count, 8. Adelia. And we can say a few things about this just to get you on the beach and get an understanding of what's going on. The collection includes both specimens from the garden and collections from the wild where growing. They were collected primarily around the Penniman farm. And this is a little bit problematic, and there may be somebody who knows where this is, but I'm not sure where it is. I think it's the present Salmon Hall at St. Michael's College, but I'm not actually sure. The whole collection is mounted on an old sort of high newsprint paper, which is an issue. And there are 60 specimens on this collection. And it's had a rough history, so that in some cases, instead of specimens, you can see where there was a specimen. So I want to begin by going the right way and introduce you to the arrival of this collection at the Pringle Herbarium. And these two notes on the upper left give you a sense of the arrival of the specimens. So these arrived at the Pringle Herbarium at the university thanks to Adelia's granddaughter. And this is her right here, E.J. Howe. They arrived in 1982. And she, I don't know if you can read it, but she basically says that this is a collection that my grandmother made with her mother, Ethan Allen's wife, in 1815. And in fact, this is the only place that there's an exact date that I know of for this collection. And it certainly is about right in terms of other factors. So I started by giving you just a sense of what these things look like. And you've got no idea how big they are, but they are about a foot wide and maybe about 15 inches high. And there's often more than one species on there. And just to give you a little sense of something that's kind of neat, up here is the orchid Arethusa. And that's actually why I included it. Oh, sorry. I need to respond. If I point it the right direction. Yeah, here's Arethusa alive, which grows here in Vermont, just in bugs. And in fact, these three plants are all here alive because they're all included in the collections of either Adelia or Fanny. And the upper left is pitcher plant, you may well know, and then one cultivated plant, which was cultivated in Vermont, is the black locust. So I'm going to dive in to give a little sense of what the collection is like. This is a little bit of shinleaf, brownleaf shinleaf, which is a local leaf plant from acid woods. So you start to get a sense that these folks weren't just in gardens. They got out into the countryside. This is 1815. And in fact, the pitcher plant and the Arethusa orchid, the local logical places for them to be discovered by these two women would either be Colchester Bog or what's sometimes called Lily Pad Pond, but it's a bog that's now in the military base for Eastern Allen inside the place there. I've actually taken students to that bog and made pollen cores into the depths of the bog. There's 10 meters of peat in one pond, so it's been a bog for a long time. So, what I want to do is get at what these specimens actually have for information, because it actually turns out to be very interesting. And you can see, sort of see the data here, but I want to get you to what we discovered is that up towards the top in the blue circle, there's a class and order with numbers. And this is actually the classification of these plants in Linnaeus's original system for the classification of plants. And I'll talk a little more about Linnaeus, but he invented classification of plants in the modern sense, literally in a single book, a 1752 book, which he started the whole thing. So about 50 years before this collection was made. There's a Latin species and genus name for each plant. There's often a common name. And then at the bottom is this sort of odd thing. It's a little message of some sort. And in this case, in this collection, the word is vanity. And this is from the language of flowers, and we'll talk more about that. In this case, we've got a tulip on the left, and a polemonium on the right, and one of the viburnums. So, what's up with Linnaeus? Well, I've chosen a particular book of his, not the original 1752 one, but I've chosen his 1767 book to give you an example of how this system works, just so you get oriented to these numbers. Up at the top, at the very top of this, sort of just to the left of his hat, you can see the top of the page, perhaps you can read it, it says Pentandria monogynia. This was Linnaeus's approach to classification of plants. He used the number of stamens, the pollen-producing parts. That's the andria part. So in this case, Pentandria, you can probably even tell me how many stamens it was. It's 5, right? Would agree? And then on the right is the number of female parts that are sort of visible in the flower. Generally picking people, we can call them pistils. Gets a little confusing. But that ends the gynia because that's like gynecology. So this has 1 pistil in this case. And that is how Linnaeus has chosen to talk about the plants on this page. And if we go back just a minute to the last slide, this is the 6th class and the 1st order, and that means that there are 6 stamens. And if you know tulips, you know there are 6 stamens sitting in tulips. So you get a sense of how Linnaeus' system works. So what we quickly know is that Fanny and Adelia were well acquainted with the Linnaean system and used it consistently to classify their plants in the herbarium. So here we are. We're out in the sticks, people. You know, there's like, what, a couple of thousand people in Burlington? And, you know, I live in Jericho. Jericho hadn't been settled yet in 1815. It was 5 years later that the Browns, walked up Brown's Trace and started farming. So this is early on. So what's up with that? Okay, and then finally this bit with the language of flowers. I just want to introduce you, maybe something you have no awareness of, but in the 19th century, people used bouquets to send messages using this symbolic system. So you can either say something very nice about somebody or something not very nice at all. And you can get some of these, something nice, adoration, not so nice, haughtiness, and so forth. And they can use, and so it turns out that this collection is a resource for the language of flowers, because the use in the Allen collection or the Penman collection is not necessarily the same with some of the consistent publications. You'll run across these books across the 19th century. There are a number of editions. I want to just contrast what they chose to put on the label with what we put on the label nowadays. This is a typical label. We still have the scientific name at the top. Now we have the author of the name, and look at the amount of geographic information now. Very specific. And look at latitude, longitude, specified elevation, and then ecological comments, date, exact date, and the collection number. So times change. But what we have is an 1815 collection. We've got a pretty good idea where they came from. So it's a lot better than that. So what kind of plants do these folks include in their building? Just to give you a sense of it, I think I've already made this clear that we have both native and non-native plants. The non-native are mostly garden plants, as opposed to weeds that are introduced from elsewhere. There are about 30 plant families represented, which is pretty good. I've listed just 5 of them here that have many of the plants in the collection. The rose family, the Asparagaceae, which includes not only asparagus but other monocots, the asters, goldenrods, that crowd, Brassicaceae, including all the mustards, in front of the Fabaceae, which are the ladies. So what were the garden, what's going on in these materials that tell us what's going on with garden plants in the early 19th century? Well, the most interesting thing about this collection is there are no cultivated plants from Asia. There's a very good reason. The great age of botanical exploration in Asia was yet to begin. It was not until several decades later that people like Thunberg actually went to Japan for the first time and put plants in a press or brought plants back for cultivation. So although we have many Asian plants in cultivation now, there's some of our real treasures like the palmate leaf maple, the Japanese maple. These are simply not in these collections, and that's a real representation of the way history has worked. There are a number of ornamentals. There are also medicinal plants amongst the cultivated plants. And some of the plants will end up being weeds in the future. There's just a few of these now. Common beans in the collection, rhubarb they collected, and one of the herbs, caraway. I do have a full list of the collections. If you're nerd enough to want to see the full list, I can provide it to the club. So what are the native plants like? Well, it is a snapshot of the local flora from diverse habitats here in the Chittenden County. And mostly widespread common species. Arethusa, by the way, the bog orchid, is a great exception to that. It's quite uncommon, and it takes a special trip out to bogs to see it. And as I said, they're across a number of habitat types. There's the little sumac on the So on the left is the beautiful showy orchid, which is in local fens, which they collected. That's interesting because there are none of these locally in Burlington. You have to get out into the countryside outside of Burlington to see that. The one in the middle is Polygola seneca, the Seneca snakeroot. This has a very interesting ecology. It goes just along the northern white cedar bluffs along Lake Champlain. Anybody who's grown up here or lived during that time knows that beautiful lakeside cliff habitat with the white cedars sort of hanging over the edge of the cliffs onto the lake. But you may not have noticed the Seneca snakeroot, which is the characteristic feature, little plant that is all along those places. So that we know that Fanny and Dealer got up there, and then we've already talked about the fish. Well, I want to dig into this a little bit, and this is somewhat new terrain for me. So you may, if you've worked on Fanny, know as much or more than I do. But I wanted to just give us all some context in who this woman is, Fanny Allen. What I did is to take all of the names that she has used over her lifetime. Frances, Brush, Montresor, Buchanan, Allen, Penn. I think I might have the order a little bit off. I should probably reverse Brush and Montresor. And I'll talk a little bit about each of these people, but to put it briefly, Fanny was actually an illegitimate daughter of a British soldier and an American woman. The soldier, at least if you read the 19th century references, was never involved in Fanny's nurturing or development. Brush is the name of what the man her mother married, and very interestingly, the Mr. Brush was actually a loyalist during the Revolutionary War. So Fanny actually ends up with her mother and her stepfather going to New York because the British are still stationed in New York, so it's a secure place for them to go as loyalists. So early on in her life, there's several episodes of going to New York, coming to Vermont, going back to New York that fit into her history. This particular portrait is the only known portrait of Fanny. It was painted in 1771 by John Singleton Copley, who you may know is a very prominent artist of the 18th century, who has the interesting, he's also a loyalist. He painted in the United States until 1774, when he immigrated to England and never returned to the United States. And he actually painted this painting in New York in 1771. How do we know that it was 1771? Because Copley only went to New York once, and he only painted about 30 people during that visit, and Fanny was one of them. So she was in enough of a position, being the daughter of Brush, the stepdaughter of Brush, to be painted by a prominent artist today. In fact, by that time, Copley was famous, and so she was very lucky as that, and we're very lucky to have this portrait. And you may have noticed that the exhibit in Fanny around the corner, they reproduced this gown on the mannequin, and they've done quite a good job. I love the bouquet. It's sort of symbolic of where she's headed as far as we're concerned. This portrait is now at the Ticonderoga Museum in New York, which is interesting because of the role of Ticonderoga Museum in the history of the revolution. Well, here's John Montresor, who is, by all accounts, Fanny's true father, blood father. He was a British Army and a cartographer, presumed father of Fanny. And interestingly, this portrait is by Copley, painted the same year in that single visit to New York. So maybe he never had anything to do with Fanny, but there's more to this story, I suspect. Now, I'll get to this in a minute, but I will mention that Fanny fell in love at an early age, like as a teenager, with a fellow who ended up getting drowned. So the first love of her life didn't go well at all, because he ended up being drowned. The second love of her life, who she married, was John Buchanan, and things didn't go well there either, because she married him in 1776, and in a year he was dead from killed during the Battle of Saratoga in 1777. He was a British soldier. So remember, there's a loyalist flow to this history, and so her whole early history is in with of course your loyalist community, which is so ironic given that the next thing she did was to meet Ethan Allen. She met him after the revolution was over in 1784. This is one of the classic representations of Ethan Allen storming Ticonderoga and saying, "Okay, it's time to surrender." They have 3 children, and one is, by the way, the Fanny Allen that everybody hears about, the one after whom the hospital is named. But things don't go very well either, because 5 years later, Ethan Allen is dead. So finally, she gets some stability in her life. She meets a fellow named Jabez Penniman, who's a reputable character. He's a local here in Vermont, right in Colchester. He's a judge, and also was hired by Jefferson during his presidency to mediate in disputes in the state. So he's quite a prominent character, and they have 4 children. And they meet in 1793, and this time the husband outlives her. So he actually makes it to 1849. She dies in 1834. And if you ever want to see the monuments are in the Elmwood Cemetery, downtown Barrington, for both Chavez Penman and for Fanny Penman. They're flat stones that are laid flat on the ground. This is Fanny's gravestone. And it's interesting because apparently the story of this, that you may be able to read her name up there. It says Frances Montgomery, wife of Dr. Chavez Penman. And I said, where's the Montezuma come from? And apparently there was a mistake about the Montresora that got incorporated into the later history of the family. By the body, Ethan gets some press here. Formerly wife of General Ethan. So now we get a sense of Fanny. So they set up at Chavez Penman's farm, which is just on the other side of the Muskie River in Colchester, near St. Mike's. And presumably that's where the garden was located. And with her youngest daughter, in 1815, they make a collection of plants. Each makes a collection of plants. There's a couple of interesting things about, if you look at the two collections, they're actually quite different. The daughters is higher quality than the mothers. So Adelia was a very good student of her mother's, in fact, too good. I've got a lot of students like that. In fact, by the way, I do hope you get to hear Wes Tester. He was, in fact, my best student, and I'm so honored to have him succeed me here at the university. Anyway, what I'd like to do is explore a little bit about the context for how the heck these two women got these names on these plants and the Linnaean numbers at this early date. What was going on in botany? Well, there was a couple of people that stand out in 18th century botany, and one person in particular stands out because she's also a woman. Jane Colby. You can get a sense of her profile from taking a look at this here, that she was a sophisticated botanist, and she ended up writing a manuscript flora of New York. And I've got a picture of that for you here. So the whole thing is manuscript with her drawings in it. And again, it's a professional job of representation of the flora in New York in 1801. And there may very well have been some kind of communication between Jane and Fanny, but we don't know yet if that's the case. But so there was a currency, a community of people that had this level of knowledge of the region, is what I'm trying to get at. Well, we talked about Linnaeus a little bit. I just want to take you through the time, the 18th century. Linnaeus, born in 1707. The big book, 1753. I think it's 1752 before. And so it said he's the one who came up with the basic layout for plants. So that's the place to start in thinking about this. And he's a candidate. His publications are a candidate for what these folks are using, because it's his artificial system, right? There are a couple of American botanists who are quite prominent, in particular John Bartram, who was a little bit senior to Linnaeus, but was a great collector of plants. And Linnaeus was very impressed by him. As you can see, this quote from Linnaeus, the greatest natural botanist in the world. And he introduced many of the plants discovered in Europe. Another character who's important in this history is André Michaux, a French person, and was the royal botanist of Louis XVI. came over here in 1785 and actually wrote the first major book about the plants of North America. And this was early enough in publication, you can see 1803, so it could have been the reference that Fanny and Adelia used. Then there's Persch. Frederick Persch, now a German, a totally different country, another fellow comes to North America and looks at the plants and does a publication. And his publication came out in 1813. The kind of precedent here that you'd have to get the Persch publication to Burlington 2 years after it was published for it to get used. So it's possible. But the award winner in my book is actually the Linnaean book itself. And there's a specific reason, and that is that there's a rhododendron that the Penniman's collect, and they call it Azalea nudiflora. And that name appears only in the 1767 Linnaeus Systema Naturae. This is the same image I showed you before, right? So I kind of loaded it, but if you check this long enough, here it is. It's the genus Azalea in the Pentandria monogynia. Okay, so rhododendrons have 5 stamens and 1 pistil sticking up in the middle, so sexual system's working. And down under the genus Azalea, we find the species nudiflora right here with its Latin description. Right? Ovate leaves, a fuzzy corolla, and long stamens, he says, are characteristic of this species. A North American species. And you can actually, I got this so you can see it close if you need to. So that's my take for the moment, is that they actually had a copy of Linnaeus' 1767 book in hand here in Vermont, which is entirely likely. Well, that's what I had to share with you today, and I just end with this. Thank you, Fanny and Adelia, for the insights you bring to us about botany and the study of plants in your talk. Yeah.
Question for you. So you might have said this in the beginning, I might have missed it, but are they digging plants out of the woods and cultivating them somewhere, or they're just taking cuttings?
I should look at the list carefully, but most of the plants that are cultivated are long-term cultivated plants. Okay, so often plants coming from Europe, being brought over and established in gardens. Tulips are a perfectly good example because they're, sort of Spain and that part of the world is where they're native. And whether they're actually bringing the live plants in the native plants into cultivation or not, that's possible.
Not from the woods to their farm, wherever they were here.
Right. But they're surrounded by great habitat.
Yeah.
I mean, you're literally right next to that canyon in the Whiskey where the High Bridge used to be. And all along there is a very rich local flora. I mean, you walk into those woods, you're hooked permanently. There's so many cool plants.
I have a question about the paper. Do you know when they affixed in paper?
Oh, this is there's all sorts of ways.
In 1815, it would have been rag.
It would have been
Rag paper. It would have been excellent.
It isn't though.
So it couldn't have been affixed.
Yeah, that's the odd thing.
So when was it affixed? Was it done by a descendant? Who knows?
Do you know anything about the acquisition of it by Pringle Herbarium?
It was a gift to the granddaughter.
Do you know
So
when?
somebody else
1918.
put it on paper, not.
No, it's their original.
Where did they get that carbon paper? They didn't make it anymore.
Mystery.
You know, Dan, I have always assumed it's pulp because it's quite
Falling
yellow.
apart, yeah.
I may be wrong.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, that's a great question. I'll have to ask somebody.
Because I was thinking, great, 1815, that means it's on that fabulous paper that never goes away.
There's quite a bit of discussion about how the heck do you preserve this stuff, sort of render it as a neutral.
Well, the Northeast Arc and the Conservation Center can tell you.
Yeah, for thousands.
Yeah, sorry.
And I don't know if you can tell from the pictures, or maybe you've seen part of the collection, but the plants are actually inserted in little
Oh, I
slits.
see that, yeah.
Yeah, and this is actually quite common in that period of time, is to make slits in the paper and then run the paper
It's a really good way to go.
Yeah. The other thing that happens early on is they get sewn on the paper. Yeah, glue is not necessarily common in the old days.
On a similar note, is what she was saying. Am I correct in that wasn't at one time a lot of these specimens, they were kept in these big wooden cabinets of the Pringle Herbarium, and then they switched them all to metal? And was this?
That's I did.
Oh, you did. Thank you. Not me, you.
Guilty.
You'll take that offense. So, my understanding was those metal cabinets were what saved it from when there was a fire there. Is that correct?
Yes.
Yep.
Okay. So we have you to thank for that this still exists.
No, you actually have the fire department.
Oh.
So we got a National Science Foundation grant in 2013 to secure the plants. And the big argument in the grant was we need to secure this collection, from damage. And we need to get out of where the cabinets are beautiful, they're exquisite. And it was just, it's a heartbreaker to replace that beautiful old wooden cabinet with the metal cabinets. But we got them all transferred in the metal. And then, 6 years later, we know why. Yeah. And you may know the story of the fire. They were renovating the building, and there's some combing over the attic windows that's made out of copper. And there's a fellow up there brazing the copper, and he wants to spark into the interior of the roof. And it was the most peculiar fire because it's a mansard roof, the steep mid-19th century roofs, and the fire ran all the way around the whole that mansard.
Wow.
It was open all the way around. It's like a little tiny, and the fire just ran right around the whole thing. And smoke came up. The young man who started the fire knew what he'd done and immediately called the fire department. You may know that the fire department has a local station literally in sight of the Pringle Herbarium. They had been in the Pringle 3 weeks beforehand just to get a tour in case there was a fire. And so the fireman and I were talking that day when everything was secure, and he said, we hopped in. I said, oh, it's the Pringle again. Let's go. They drive out the door, and he looks up, it's not a drill. It's not a drill this time. Off they go. So they were there within 5 minutes of the fire starting. And it was, there were a lot of flames for a while, but it was all up there. None of it ever got inside the collection. But our big problem was water.
Okay, so I wanted to really quick jump back to the question of the paper, because I want to maybe point out to the audience and also just announce that almost no one's ever studied Fanny until very recently. Our museum created a short documentary film on her that premiered last summer, but prior to that, there was almost no research on her, and so we are still finding new things all the time, like someone who has knowledge about the history of paper pointing out, wait, that can't be true, and that's happened so much that like our documentary film, by the time it premiered last summer, we already knew there were inaccuracies in it from the filming the year before. But I like to think of it as that's a good sign, because that means we've inspired more people to look into Fanny and her historical experience, so that people have, found new information. So I have to say, if you do go to our website to watch the little documentary, it mentions that Margaret is her aunt, and we now know that there was a whole cover-up story, and there's drama with it, but she's probably her birth mother, we think. And the other thing I just really quick want to say, David, you mentioned Fanny's tragic love life in her early years, and mentioned her first love drowned, and then you worded it as the loves of the next for life. And I would like to point out, because I think it's a really significant part of Fanny's identity, is that I don't think she loved any of the other men. I don't think she married for love for any of them. And I just want to point that out, because, that was a strength of women back then, was to marry strategically and not necessarily for love. And if you look at her story, and especially her relationship to land ownership, it really clarifies why she married who she married.
The appeal to Ethan Allen for her was that he could be an agent to help her regain the property.
Right, exactly. Which he did, and then of course he legally owned it.
Right.
Because he
So they were living at the Penniman farm at Winooski Park. Who was living here during that time?
So Ethan Allen and Fanny lived here after they moved up from Sunderland, and then Fanny lived here off and on, including with her next husband, Jabez Penniman. It's her husband, Jabez Penniman, that she moved to Colchester with in the early 1800s.
So had they sold this farm by that time when she was collecting these specimens? Or
right around the time she was collecting these specimens was about the time they sold this farm, but they were also embroiled in legal battles over the land for about a decade prior to that.
She was also having Chavez and she were having an argument with Ira Allen.
Yes.
Taking care of the kids from the first from
right.
Allen.
The lawsuit is about
just a mess.
The lawsuit is about the caretakership of the sons, but it's really about land ownership, because it's the baby boys who inherited this property, not the widow Fanny. So and Fanny again married a man who could represent her interest in court, and Penniman sued Ira Allen for the caretaker position of the sons, so that Fanny could basically take this land back again. So again, marrying another time strategically.
You had your...
I wonder if you know any more about how she decided what plants to put in there. I mean, for instance, there isn't much in the way of food, so I don't think it was everything growing on the Penniman farm.
No, it's obviously cultivated, horticulture.
Yeah.
Yeah, so there's clearly a strong interest in the garden as an ornamental.
Because we're trying to incorporate a little of it into the gardens here, which have been primarily herbs. Some of which are in her list as well, but trying to get a sense of what she might have been aware of, and this would be the late 1780s, but what she would have been aware of and might have had in her garden here as a frontier garden at that point.
Well, you certainly would get a sense of that from the full collection. By the way, the list that I have for the plants in the collection is a recently curated list. So if you are working here,
Wes just gave us
we got a copy with 6, a spreadsheet
okay, so you did
with
okay.
60 plants on it.
Okay, so that is the new list. Yeah, that was done. Sonia DeYoung and I worked that up just the last couple of weeks. Yeah.
Is there any place people can see it?
See the list? Up till now, it's just a copy on the computer.
But people can make appointments with the Pringle Herbarium to actually see the paper.
We're happy. Yeah, if you want to come see the actual collection, Wes and I would be happy to show you.
They're beautiful.
We actually got scholars in probably 1 or 2 a year, people, for some one reason or another, have interest.
Like what Jane just said, just having it digitized, because then you can, you know, if you don't happen to be right out of next town over, definitely do that. And you would be able to know what was in the collection.
The collection is at least in part digitized online. So if you go to the Pringle Herbarium website, there's, I think, about 35 sheets are digitized. I don't think they're all there. The majority. In fact, since I started this morning on this tour, all of my images are from that. Downloaded from it. They're free.
You just made this today?
What? Yeah, 5 o'clock. 5 o'clock this morning. Cup of coffee.
And thank you for all for coming. We really appreciate it. Yes, Diane?
I'm sorry. I was thinking about so much about David Blow, the recipient. I didn't say what an honor to have an achievement named for Lillian Baker Carlisle. Thank you so much. It's a great honor.
Thank you for all for coming, and I'm sure David would answer any individual questions you may still have. And enjoy the rest of the weekend. And we're here tomorrow.
If you get a chance to go to Fort Tiger on yoga, this orchard is 3 feet tall. It's huge. Just